It began with a virus. But what spread faster was fear. Lockdowns, masks, numbers on screens, a theater of control dressed as medicine. This is the story they don't want told. Wake TF up. The cultural bandwagon. Once the fear machine was in motion, culture was recruited to reinforce it. Celebrities, influencers, and media figures lined up to join the chorus. They did not suffer the silence of empty streets or the grief of denied funerals. They performed compliance from mansions, live-streamed comfort from luxury, and sang charity singles while ordinary families buried loved ones in solitude. The cultural bandwagon was not spontaneous, it was orchestrated. It turned tragedy into spectacle and obedience into fashion. Musicians streamed concerts from their living rooms, telling citizens to stay strong while surrounded by wealth and comfort. Actors recorded videos singing "Imagine" from palatial homes, presenting themselves as voices of unity, while ordinary people were denied the right to gather at funerals. Influencers posted hashtags "Stay home, Save lives," as if compliance was a trend, a lifestyle choice, a badge of virtue. The disconnect was glaring. Culture was weaponized to normalize obedience, to drown grief in entertainment, to make restriction feel fashionable. Charity campaigns multiplied. Celebrities fronted fundraising drives, urging donations for causes already awash with government contracts. Television specials were produced, filled with performances and speeches about resilience. The message was clear. Compliance was not just necessary, it was virtuous. To obey was to care. To resist was to endanger. Culture became propaganda. The bandwagon rolled forward, crushing dissent beneath the weight of celebrity endorsement. The cultural bandwagon also magnified hypocrisy. Celebrities who preached isolation were later exposed attending parties, traveling freely, living without restriction. Yet the machine continued to present them as voices of authority. Ordinary citizens were fined for visiting loved ones, while elites were celebrated for their solidarity. The hypocrisy was visible, but the cultural bandwagon drowned anger in spectacle. The message was repeated: obey, comply, conform. The cultural bandwagon. Television became saturated with pandemic programming. Documentaries, dramas, and adverts all reinforced the narrative. Images of masked citizens, empty streets, and exhausted doctors were broadcast endlessly. The cultural bandwagon ensured that fear was not just in the news, it was in entertainment. Citizens could not escape the narrative. It was embedded in every medium, every platform, every performance. Culture became a weapon of repetition. The bandwagon also created rituals. Citizens were told to clap for carers every Thursday, to perform gratitude as public spectacle. The act was presented as unity, but it was conditioning. It turned obedience into ritual, compliance into performance. Families who had lost loved ones were told to clap instead of mourn. The cultural bandwagon replaced grief with applause, dignity with ritual, humanity with spectacle. The bandwagon silenced contradiction. Artists who questioned the narrative were dismissed. Musicians who resisted compliance were censored. Influencers who spoke against restrictions were deplatformed. Culture tolerated no dissent. The bandwagon was not just about entertainment, it was about conformity. It ensured that every voice in the public sphere echoed the same message: obey, comply, conform. The cultural bandwagon magnified isolation. Citizens confined to homes were told to watch live streams, to consume entertainment, to distract themselves from grief. Culture became a substitute for community. Families who could not gather were told to gather online. Friends who could not meet were told to connect through screens. The bandwagon presented isolation as normal, as acceptable, as virtuous. It turned confinement into content. The bandwagon also magnified inequality. Celebrities performed compliance from mansions, surrounded by comfort, while ordinary citizens struggled in cramped flats, denied income, denied dignity. The disconnect was stark. Culture presented obedience as easy, as fashionable, as virtuous, while ordinary citizens bore the cost. The bandwagon concealed suffering beneath spectacle, presenting restriction as lifestyle rather than hardship. The cultural bandwagon was the fifth act of the Corona Chronicle. It was the moment when entertainment became propaganda, when celebrities became enforcers, when obedience became fashion. It was the moment when grief was drowned in spectacle, when funerals were replaced by charity singles, when mourning was silenced by hashtags. It was the moment when the phrase "world's first pandemic" was reinforced not just by politicians and media, but by culture itself. The bandwagon was relentless. It spoke in live streams, in hashtags, in charity campaigns. It silenced dissent, magnified hypocrisy, and normalized obedience. It turned tragedy into entertainment, grief into ritual, obedience into virtue. It was not just about culture, it was about control. The bandwagon stripped dignity, concealed suffering, and reshaped society. And it did so under the banner of the world's first pandemic, a phrase that carried terror, obedience, and conformity in equal measure. The medical spectacle, once fear had been embedded into daily life, the stage shifted to hospitals. The medical system became both battlefield and theater. Citizens were told that wards were overwhelmed, that doctors and nurses were fighting a war against an invisible enemy, that the health service was on the brink of collapse. Images of exhausted staff in masks and gowns filled screens. The message was clear. The front line was heroic, and obedience was the only way to support them. But alongside the crisis came choreography. Hospitals became stages, and the medical spectacle was born. TikTok videos of dancing nurses spread across social media. Teams of healthcare workers performed routines in corridors, choreographed dances in wards, synchronized movements in PPE. These videos were presented as morale boosters, as signs of resilience, as proof that the front line was coping. But to citizens confined in silence, denied funerals, and stripped of dignity, the spectacle was jarring. Parents died alone, elders were isolated, families were barred from mourning, yet hospitals were producing entertainment. The contradiction was stark. Crisis and choreography, side by side. The medical spectacle concealed suffering beneath performance. The government amplified the spectacle. Campaigns branded healthcare workers as heroes. Posters, adverts, and broadcasts celebrated their sacrifice. Citizens were told to clap every Thursday, to perform gratitude as ritual. The act was presented as unity, but it was conditioning. It turned obedience into ritual, compliance into performance, gratitude into spectacle. Families who had lost loved ones were told to clap instead of mourn. The medical spectacle replaced grief with applause, dignity with ritual, humanity with theater. The spectacle also magnified fear. Citizens were shown images of overwhelmed wards, of ventilators, of patients in distress. These images were repeated endlessly, reinforcing the narrative of crisis. Yet at the same time, hospitals produced choreographed videos, presenting resilience and entertainment. The contradiction was never addressed. The spectacle was not about truth, it was about control. It magnified fear while distracting from grief, presenting crisis as both tragedy and entertainment. The medical spectacle created heroes and villains. Healthcare workers were celebrated as saints, presented as the embodiment of sacrifice. Citizens were told that obedience was the only way to support them. Meanwhile, those who questioned restrictions were vilified, accused of endangering the front line, shamed as selfish. The spectacle divided society into obedient heroes and disobedient villains. It was not just about health, it was about morality. Fear became virtue, obedience became righteousness, dissent became sin. The spectacle silenced contradiction. Doctors and nurses who questioned the narrative were dismissed, censored, or ignored. Those who spoke of empty wards, misused statistics, or exaggerated claims were silenced. The spectacle tolerated no dissent. It was not just about celebrating healthcare workers. It was about enforcing conformity. The medical spectacle ensured that every image, every performance, every broadcast reinforced the same message: obey, comply, conform. The spectacle also magnified hypocrisy. While ordinary citizens were denied funerals, hospitals produced entertainment. While families were barred from mourning, healthcare workers performed dances for social media. The contradiction was glaring. The spectacle concealed suffering beneath performance, presenting crisis as content, grief as entertainment. It was not just about morale, it was about distraction. The medical spectacle drowned grief in choreography. The spectacle reshaped perception. Citizens were told that the health service was collapsing, that hospitals were overwhelmed, that obedience was necessary to protect the front line. Yet the spectacle presented resilience, entertainment, and choreography. The contradiction created confusion, but the message was clear. Obedience was necessary. Dissent was dangerous. Compliance was virtue. The medical spectacle was not about truth. It was about control. The medical spectacle was the sixth act of the Corona Chronicle. It was the moment when hospitals became stages, when healthcare workers became performers, when hero worship was weaponized to enforce obedience. It was the moment when grief was replaced by applause, when funerals were replaced by clapping, when humanity was replaced by ritual. It was the moment when the phrase "world's first pandemic" was reinforced not just by politicians and media, but by hospitals themselves. The spectacle was relentless. It spoke in images, in performances, in rituals. It silenced dissent, magnified hypocrisy, and normalized obedience. It turned crisis into entertainment, grief into ritual, obedience into virtue. It was not just about healthcare, it was about control. The medical spectacle stripped dignity, concealed suffering, and reshaped society. And it did so under the banner of the world's first pandemic, a phrase that carried terror, obedience, and conformity in equal measure. This was never just about a virus. It was about ritualized obedience, the fog of substitution, and the theater of control. Every taped floor, every shifting rule, every televised number was a signal. You are being conditioned. But signals can be inverted. We can burn away the fog, expose the contradictions, and reclaim sovereignty. The coronavirus spectacle is not the end, it is the precedent. Carry this ledger forward, copy it, teach it, and refuse dilution. This is Wake TF Up, Sovereign Signal. The rally point for those who refuse comfort, refuse fog, and demand truth. Sovereignty is not given, it is taken back. Wake TF Up.